What was that, Mom?
All right, hi guys. This is the 2012 free response question. I just wanted to do a little quick demo in case you had a question about it. This is one that we worked on in class. Okay. Start.
Rolling.
Okay. So, hi everyone. I just wanted to spend a couple minutes on this 2012 free response question. This is one that we actually did in class. You guys checked your answers on the answer key on the board. But in case you had questions about it, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a, kind of a sample running of it. So this is the question about Steve Rail, and the question reads, Steve Rail, the only provider of train service operating between two cities, is currently incurring economic losses. And so because this is the only provider of train service, I know anytime the AP folks are going to give me a question that is about, the only provider, the only firm, then we know it's monopoly question. And we also know in this case they're earning economic losses. So we are asked to draw a graph of the monopoly to showcase these economic losses as well as a couple of other things. So like all monopolies, you're going to be drawing the demand curve, and then you're going to be drawing the MR curve less than the demand curve, okay, so something like that. You're going to have a marginal cost curve, and in this case, because the monopoly is not earning a profit, it's earning a loss, we know that our ATC curve will be above the demand curve, okay? So I drew my minimum point, is a little bit rusty, but imagine this is your minimum point. So we're asked first to kind of note the quantity. This would be the profit maximizing or the loss minimizing quantity. They mean exactly the same thing. So this where MR equals MC, this spot here, this is my quantity for the monopoly. And for the price, I am not going to go over here for the price. I'm going to use the demand curve. A profit maximizing or loss minimizing monopolist is always going to price at the demand curve. Okay, it's the highest price that they can charge at that quantity. This is what consumers are willing to pay. So this is the quantity, the price in the monopoly, okay? And because they're making a loss, right, at this particular quantity, I might want to note this is the price. So the price, unfortunately for this monopoly, is less than the ATC at this quantity. Okay, so at this quantity, the ACT is all the way up here. I might draw a line over, dotted line. This is where the ATC amount is, and this is then where I would find my loss. Okay, so I can shade that. That's the loss. So I have my profit maximizing or loss minimizing quantity, I have the monopoly price, and I have my loss. I have my ATC curve, making sure that the minimum ATC intersects marginal cost, and anytime you're doing a loss. Now, if you were given instructions where you had to say this was a monopoly making a loss, but in a situation where it wasn't shutting down, you might also show the ABC curve. And you could show the ABC curve on this. I'm not putting it on just to make the graph a little bit cleaner, but if they're making a loss and they were in a situation where they had an ABC curve that was like way below their price, they would have to shut down. So the shutdown rule still applies for a monopoly. So if we have to do the allocatively efficient quantity also, which we have to label QE. So in perfect competition, I know that the allocatively efficient quantity would be where P, where the price, is equal to the marginal cost. So in this case, for the monopolist, even though it's not where they're actually pricing or producing, I can still denote the quantity where the price, noted by the demand curve, is equal to marginal cost, okay? Where these two curves intersect, I would actually have an amount here, right? The price and the marginal cost would be equal in that place. This would be the socially optimal quantity, okay? So I can put quantity E here. Now clearly, because we have the monopolist quantity at the lower quantity and the socially optimal or allocatively efficient quantity where the demand curve is intersecting the marginal cost, we know that this monopoly is inefficient, right? And all profit maximizing monopolies are, because by nature they're underproducing and they're also charging way too high of a price. So if this was a perfectly competitive firm, it would be, in the long run at least, it would be allocatively efficient, okay? This is the allocatively efficient quantity. We are also asked in Part B if Steve Rail raised the price above the monopoly price, and what would happen at this quantity. So if we raise the price above PM identified in Part A, would total revenue increase, decrease, or change, or not change? So in this case, I can just simply apply the total revenue test. Basically, if I'm at this particular quantity, right, and I'm wondering if this particular quantity is in the elastic section or the inelastic section of the demand curve, my one rule of thumb is to use my marginal revenue. So everywhere where the marginal revenue is a positive number, right, so all the way up until the quantity where MR equals 0, this would be the spot that would be unit elastic, where MR equals 0, the part of the demand curve kind of straight up from that, that would be revenue maximizing, but everything that's a quantity less than that is going to be in the elastic portion of the demand curve, okay? So I know at this quantity, this is the elastic portion of the demand curve because the marginal revenue is positive. Even though it's a declining, it's a kind of a diminishing number, it is still a positive number. And then I know from the total revenue test, if I raise the price, and I'm in a situation where my I have this, if I have an elastic situation, if I raise the price, my quantity bump is going to be really drastic, right? I raise the price a small percent, and my quantity percent change is massive. I am going to, end up with a lot less quantity, and I will lose revenue. Okay, so the total revenue test tells me if I'm in the elastic range and I raise the price, my total revenue is going down. Okay, so the answer to Part B is that my total revenue would be decreasing. Okay. For Part C, per unit subsidy is provided, okay? So this difference between the per unit subsidy and the lump sum subsidy, okay? So we're looking at Part C and Part D. For the per unit subsidy, okay, we're going to assume something happens with a per unit subsidy. Money is going to be given to the firm, and the firm is going to apply that money for every single quantity. They're kind of getting like change, money that's going to be dedicated to lowering the cost of every single quantity that they produce, okay? This is actually, in effect, lowering their variable costs. What this will do is reduce the marginal cost curve. So we'll kind of just, graph this in here in like a dotted line. The marginal cost curve is going to shift, okay? It only shifts if you have a change in variable costs, and a per unit subsidy would be such a change, okay? Another example of a variable cost change would be anything that changes when quantity increases or decreases. So your labor costs, the cost of, your tomatoes, if you were making pizza, an ingredient you might use to make more and more and more pizza, okay? So your marginal cost would actually shift downwards. That has an effect. Whenever marginal cost shifts, you're now at a new profit maximizing point, and so your quantity, okay, instead of being quantity M here, you're going to be quantity M here. Now the AP folks, the way they set up this question, they're not really asking you to graph this. You don't necessarily have to graph this, but they are asking you, assume a per unit subsidy is provided to Steve Rail. Will Steve Rail's quantity increase, decrease, or not change? Okay, and so generally you're going to see the quantity increase because the marginal cost curve has shifted downward. Will consumer surplus increase, decrease, or not change? So, there's a couple of things to note, right? On one hand, right, our marginal cost curve has changed and our demand curve hasn't, right? So on one hand, you might be thinking, well, I don't know if consumer surplus changes, it's related to the demand curve. However, your price does change once your quantity changes. So that shift to the marginal cost curve, okay, actually is going to lead to a new quantity, which leads to a new price, okay? So this price here on the demand curve is going to be a lower price. So instead of PM, you end up with, let's say, call it PM1, and as a result, the consumer surplus is actually going to increase. Before, your price was here, and there was still some demand above the price, so some consumers were receiving surplus. They were willing to pay more than the price that the monopoly was charging. when the subsidy occurs and the quantity increases, what ends up happening is your price goes lower, but your consumer surplus increases, okay? So in this case, you have a situation where your consumer surplus is larger after the marginal cost curve shift. Now, just like one other thing to note, it's not on this AP question, but in the case of a variable cost shift, so imagine that you had to graph the effects of of a per unit subsidy. Your marginal cost curve shifts. That has one consequence, new quantity. But the second thing that happens is you also have a downward shift in your ATC, okay? Both of those things would happen in the case of a variable cost decrease, okay? So your marginal cost shifts, but so does your ATC. And that also has some consequences in terms of profits and losses. So if your costs are going to be different, your whole ATC curve shifts downward, you know, you're going to be in a better situation. This could be a monopoly if it shifted enough that would not necessarily be making a loss, okay? So the next thing you had to do was assume instead that it was a lump sum subsidy. And this is kind of like a very classic, you know, College Board question. The difference with a lump sum subsidy is that your marginal cost curve does not change. We assume a lump sum subsidy is money still that the firm gets. So the firm's going to get this money and it will lower their ATC, but a lump sum subsidy is not going to have this effect of the greater quantity, because your marginal cost curve isn't going to move, your marginal revenue curve isn't going to move, so your quantity is going to stay here even though your ATC curve is going to move, okay? So we're asked in this question, will the deadweight loss increase, decrease, or not change, okay? And in this case, there is the exact same deadweight loss. You know, why? Because your quantity didn't change. This monopoly has deadweight loss, okay? The deadweight loss is always going to be the monopoly underproducing, not producing at the socially optimal quantity, and we know that because the socially optimal quantity or allocatively efficient quantity is quantity E, okay? And the monopoly is producing here at the quantity of M. So the deadweight loss, okay, is going to be this triangle. We'll make it right here, okay? Now, if you had a situation where you had an MC shift, you'd have a new profit maximizing quantity, and if it was a subsidy, you might be in a situation where you would see perhaps a change in your deadweight loss. In this case, MC doesn't move, MC and MR stays the same, the deadweight loss is the same. Socially optimal point is the same, the monopoly producing quantity is the same exact deadweight loss, okay? And then will Steve Rail's economic losses increase, decrease, or not change? Well, like any subsidy, even though this is a lump sum subsidy and we assume it kind of gets dedicated to fixed costs rather than variable, you're still going to see an ATC drop, okay? So it's not that there's no effect at all with a lump sum. Your marginal cost curve doesn't shift, but your ATC curve does, okay? So we know in this case, right, what will happen to his economic losses. Well, ultimately, if the curve decreases, his losses should decrease, right? He's going to be in a better position to make fewer losses, okay? And depending on how far that curve were to go down, his losses should definitely decrease, okay? So I hope that helped a little bit. Just keep letting me know how I can help you out in class. Okie doke.